Ground-penetrating radar has suggested that there may be up to 22 total rings spread out over 9 hectares. Given the massive scale and ancient date of the site, it has drastically reshaped the current view of the Neolithic past. More spectacular than the mere presence of such structures is the elaborate reliefs adorning the pillars. It is my argument that given the antiquity of these structures and the high quality of artistic ability, one must not simply focus on the present alone, but also view the people that constructed Göbekli Tepe as an advanced culture, one who is well organized and capable of presenting their natural world in pictorial representation, that through visual representation they symbolically domesticated nature. Although evidence may be brought to light to contradict this claim, the creators of Göbekli Tepe represent the peak of artistic ability in the Neolithic era, and whose achievements influenced the Mediterranean, Levantine, and Fertile Crescent area. To support this thesis, I will detail the geographic and climatic events that gave birth to the construction of Göbekli Tepe, and conclude with a hypothetical understanding of the site abandonment. This study will also examine the beach found within Enclosure in detail, and through them, hope to gain insight into the Neolithic understanding of nature and purpose of the grandiose construction. In summation, this research hopes to shed light and comprehension on both the current theories and of the current impact Göbekli Tepe holds in the future of study. The site on the northern border of the Rock Plain, Tel or Tepe, meaning hill in the Turkish language, is at one of the tallest places in the Göbekli Tepe, standing at 15 meters prior to excavation. The present-day climate of the area is arid and steppe-like conditions with very cold winters and heavy rains, blistering summers reaching over 45 degrees Celsius. Excavations are limited to 2 different times of year, in the spring and fall, skipping the wet and cold winters and unbearably hot summers. In 10,000 BC, although the weather seems less than desirable for settlement now, it may have looked very different during the period of initial construction and use of Göbekli Tepe. In 10,000 BC, of which the oldest layer 3 of Göbekli Tepe has been dated to, the Earth underwent a drastic change in climate. Since the last ice age, the world has undergone a warming trend. Around 12,800 years ago, this warming trend underwent a reversion to colder conditions. This event, called the Younger Dryas, considered a near global event, theoretically would have caused windy, dry, and low vegetative conditions. When the Younger Dryas ended around 11,600 years ago, a period of warming would have resumed, potentially causing increased rainfall and conditions conducive to the expanded vegetation. When the Younger Dryas ended around 11,600 years ago, the period of warming would have resumed, potentially causing increased rainfall and conditions conducive to expanded vegetation. The disruption caused by the Younger Dryas is thought to have caused a widespread dispersal in populated areas, but as it came to an end, conditions would have drastically improved. These climatic improvements would have allowed for environmental circumstances more conducive to sedentary lifestyle. For example, warmer conditions, a greater abundance of wild cereals, and flourishing wildlife. Within 1,000 years of building this, we developed the technical know-how to domesticate cereals and animals. The site of Göbekli Tepe is unique to the rest of the world, but also part of the 200-kilometer stretch of archaeological and date-similar sites. The site is best known in this expanse of the Turkish-Syrian border area of Megalithic, Şerekal Ahmar in Syria, Jade, Tel Shek-Hassan, and Kanyonu Tepesi, and Göbekli Tepe. The common characteristics between these sites lie in the locality and proximity to one another. The construction style, artistic and architectural technique, and date proximity, mid-11th millennium to the 9th millennium. However, these sites tend to be a complex of residential, workshop, and even courtyard structures, with the occasional sanctuary identified, for example, as a laboratory. What makes Göbekli Tepe so unique is not only the preservation level of the site and the accessibility due to the political stable country, but the lack of evidence for any housing structures. Given the current understanding of the site, Göbekli Tepe is seen as serving a religious function rather than a settlement. In fact, the site of Göbekli Tepe is simply not home to a few visible rings of standing stone pillars carved with different and most likely sacred imagery. It can be determined the presence of cut limestone quarry noted in the 1963 Turkish-American survey and in the 1980 report of the mound led to renewed interest in the mid-1990s. As reported in 2004-2005, an article entitled "Archaeology precise regional style of sacred architecture. And yet the excavators at Göbekli Tepe theorized it was the ritual or sacred center of a 200-kilometer network of sites. Archaeologists squashed it, even goes as far as to say Göbekli Tepe was not a mundane settlement of the period, but a site belonging to a religious sphere, a sacred area. He continues, Göbekli Tepe seems to have been the regional center where communities met to engage in complex rites. One puzzling attribute of Göbekli Tepe is the manner in which the site was abandoned. According to carbon-14 dating conducted on the soil filling the megalithic structures, the approximate date for burial and abandonment is circa 8,240 to 7,780 BCE, a date that coincides with the 8.2K event. And the evidence of occupation found in the backfill is in the form of refuse. A few figurines, stone statues, flint material, animal remains, and a few, but some examples of carbonized plant material. The style in which the site was abandoned created the right environment, preserving the megaliths in pristine condition until their discovery and excavation in the 90s. Göbekli Tepe is viewed in 3 layers. Layer 3 being the oldest and most important stratigraphic layer of the T-shaped pillars with relief carvings dated to the PDNA or the mid-PDNA, and is found at a depth of approximately 15 years. Layers 2 and 1 consist of the surface levels, backfill, and what has been described as a series of sanctuaries. At layer 2, the circular arrangement was exchanged for smaller rectangular rooms, but still remained the identifying characteristics of the sanctuary. The T-shaped pillars. The layer 2 is also thought to date to the 9th millennium, but over the millennium between layer 3 and 2 construction phases, architecture was dramatically reduced in size. For example, the average pillar's height was reduced by over half the size of layer 3, and the 10 to 20 meters in diameter of the megalithic enclosures were diminished to reflect the smaller and rectangular aesthetic. Although there is no evidence to light, there may be even an older level under layer 3. As of 2010, there are 4 major enclosures, A, B, C, and D, and 51 total D-shaped pillars belonging to layer 3, held in place by rings of fieldstone walls set in clay mortar in the style of asphalt masonry. 2 questions are raised. First, who are the builders and users of Göbekli Tepe? And second, why did they choose this area to venerate? To discuss this question, one must first look at an unlikely millennium. The second, and more precisely, the 19th century. This period marked mankind's raised curiosity to understand their own antiquity, and subsequently sparked a revolution in thought. One of the chief contributors to understanding the Neolithic lifestyle was D. Gordon Child, an early 20th century scholar of anthropology. Child's idea of the Neolithic Revolution began the framework for understanding the move from hunter-gatherer societies into the early agricultural complexes. This revolution was a breaking point in the human psyche that paved way for civilization through farming, permanent structures of population. However theoretical this theory is, it does offer an explanation for the inexplicable move from small groups of hunter-gatherers to fully formed and functioning cities. The question arises as to where Göbekli Tepe fits in our understanding of the Neolithic life. The very presence of the Neolithic structures in the antiquity of Göbekli Tepe challenges our perception of the Stone Age barbarians of whom Child wrote. Although rather tactlessly stated, Göbekli Tepe may have been a holy place for people to gather. It may have also been a Neolithic version of Disneyland. Although the statement should not be taken seriously, it does convey an important conclusion. No one knows what was taking place here. It seems as though Göbekli Tepe is a virtual time capsule from when hunter-gatherers from the end of the Pleistocene began moving towards not only a domestication of plants and animals, but also towards a domestication of themselves. Given the evidence that there are no permanent housing structures at Göbekli Tepe, and that it predates any known domesticated plants or animals, the hypothesis that the constructors of Göbekli Tepe lived a nomadic lifestyle and probably only visited the site on a seasonal basis is likely. It is not quite Disneyland, but perhaps this area held features that allowed for an easier way of life for hunter-gatherers. For example, an abundance of wildlife, freshwater rivers, and wild plants. There is even a possibility that what might be stone basins may have been used for the fermentation of alcohol on the site. Göbekli Tepe is well situated to offer the capabilities for survival. As the region is covered with wild barley and wild oats, it is closely located to the genetic ancestors of the now cultivated Icon wheat near the Karaka area. Although there were not an abundant amount of botanicals found on site, excavators uncovered purpose of analysis, enclosure D will serve to properly illustrate the quality, style, and variety of elements as a whole. Before analysis on individual pillars, a brief description of the topographical layout and description of enclosure D will be addressed. In this schematic site plan, we can see the general layout of the excavated enclosures. To the upper left is the detail of enclosure D as it appeared in 2007, and the location of the pillars making up the circles and central pillars. Difficulty arrived excavating a site that has been covered by several meters of backfill, and the careful process that must be undertaken, uncovering something buried in the ninth millennium. As stated, much of the backfill consists of tools, bones, both human and animal, stones from the nearby valley, and the debris from cutting and shaping so much limestone. Although the western portion of the enclosure was reappropriated by layer 2, it can be seen that the pillars continue to hold some level of significance to the pre-pottery Neolithic B. After uncovering the floor of enclosure D, the floors were found to be terrazzo, which remains constant throughout the site. The terrazzo flooring is a trait of the complex of sites connected with Göbekli Tepe stylistically. At two of these sites, Kinonu and the coal building 2 at Megalithic, the floors contain channels located in the corners. In these channels, traces of human blood were found, unveiling an interesting element to the purpose, and perhaps evidence will be found of similar activities at Göbekli. To begin to understand the artistic elements found at the pillars making up enclosure D, primary attention must be placed upon pillar 18 and 31, or the two central pillars. Pillar 18 is the eastern central pillar, and it depicts an anthropomorphized man wearing an elaborate belt. The pillar in the upright position stands at 5.4 meters in height and rests on a base decorated with a repeating pattern of large-billed and large-footed fowl, perhaps a duck or other water bird. On the side facing the interior of the enclosure, we can see a wild fox carved in relief in the crook of the elbow resting against the body of the pillars. When viewing the frontal image detail of belt and hands, it's clear the ability for precision skill the shapers of this limestone must have held. Although there is a sense of schematic and abstractional representation of the human body, it can be fathomed that the belt, with markings similar to an ancient parentheses, it's hard to see, sorry, animal belt up on the front, perhaps a fox, was used to cover the groin area, and a long shawl or stole covering the front of the body were actually based on actual garments worn during ritualistic activities. There's a strong contrasting aesthetic and stylistic element between these anthropomorphized pillars and the earth statue found near the Megalithic from the early Neolithic. The earth statue features a realistic human figure with precisely depicted eyes, mouth, and nose. Perhaps pillar 18 can be viewed as a representation of someone who held authority as a shaman for Neolithic times, and who identified what could become the fox under a symbolic shamanistic transformation. The fox, located in the elbow area, seems in a defensive posture, his ears poised and tail extended and puffed out. There's a semblance of a stiff, rigid body ready to react at any side of aggression. The other central pillar of the west side is another anthropomorphic pillar similar to pillar 18, pillar 31. It stands at an interesting 5.3 meters, slightly lower than pillar 18. In situ and prior to full excavation, pillar 31 clearly shows a blue cranium pendant, a very early representation of a possible bull pole, similar to that at Suppositions. Pillar 31 and pillar 18 show an anthropomorphized figure with arms and belt and the bull skull pendant. Unlike pillar 18, the pedestal is not decorated, but remains consistent with the pedestals found in enclosure C. The significance between these two pedestals, decorated and undecorated, is unknown. It is thought both that the central pillars are of male gender based upon other clay figurines adorned with bells and clear signs of male genitalia found at the Megalithic. A theory brought forth by Koshnet is that both pillar 18 and 31 represented twins or siblings. In these central pillars, if these central pillars were intended to be representational of mythological beings or to show human beings in contemporary ritualistic activity or even ancestral worship, the meaning is theoretical at the present. Like pillar 18, pillar 31 was realistic relief carving of a fox on the left center face, but this time seems to be reared up to attack, creating an interplay between the two foxes. Pillar 43 is perhaps one of the closest representations of the myth, in quotations, pictographically found. The image shows a large bird, probably a vulture, sitting in a very human posture. The head and body, like most of the art found in the pillars, is in profile inside them. The puzzling detail is the orb hovering above the left wing. You can see it there. The idea of a vulture or scavenger bird appearing as a symbol of reverence is odd when compared to modern associations with death. To a Neolithic hunter-gatherer, the vulture held the power to fly, left with circles above the head, waving to claim any scraps of game left behind. The orb, therefore, could very well represent the sun. Still, associated with death, the vulture could have also been seen as a vehicle to the sun or heaven. Theoretically, by leaving your dead out to be picked clean by the vultures, or excarnation, the body was carried to the afterworld and purified. Pillar 43 also brings to light a unique image of an infallible headless figure located in the lower right of the image. It's down here. It's found in register with a scorpion, a bird's head, a hole, and a vulture in the upper register. It's possible to look at this as a violent death. However, at Châteauneuf, there is a similar iconography showing headless figures in conjunction with a bird, and that's actually in our one must also think towards the cycle of death and fertility, all parts of the natural world and the continual cycle of life. This could also point to the possibility of the cult of the dead, which takes the skull of the dead and adds plaster features, practice known as Châteauneuf. Plastering skulls is well documented at Jericho and Enclosure, where several PPNP skulls were found covered in plaster and specific treatment given to the eyes and nose. This practice, although no evidence today has been found at Göbekli, is linked with widespread transmission of social memory through the removal and passing down of human skulls. Pillar 38 is a prime example of the careful detail and attention taken to accurately represent animals. Here is found an image of the fox in the upper, wild boar middle, and the lower register, 3 crane-like birds. Although there are no indications of sex in the cranes, there are definitely male genitalia on the fox and the boar. That's another image of the cranes. The boar, startling and equipped with menacing tusks, shows a ferocity unequaled by the fox and birds. And yet these images can be seen as symbolic. The fox, warmth and cunning; the boar, food and power; and the crane, fertility and feminine. These 3 creatures are found abundantly carved in relief on pillars at Göbekli Tepe, along with cats, wolves, insects, snakes, lizards, other birds, aurochs, goats, rams, and scorpions. There seems to be an emphasis on the predatory varieties of animals in the Neolithic world. These symbols of fear and aggression can serve an anthropomorphized function, and examples are found throughout the Near East, Anatolia, and Levant. A 12,000-year-old woman was found buried in Israel with parts of a wild boar, eagle, wild cattle, leopard, and a marten. And at Shref al-Hamar, stone benches arranged in circular patterns were found decorated with serpents, as well as a cello with images of raptors. One of the interesting points to remember is that the shapers of Göbekli Tepe did not have the luxury of cultivated crops, and instead supplied meat from domesticated animals. Yet even though the lack of luxuries, which are usually associated and considered the precursors of civilization, they were capable of demonstrating an uncanny artistic skill and an impressive level of organization. These pillars and their arrangements were not the product of one man, but a systematic labor force working homogeneously together to achieve their vision. I agree with Ian Hodder and the late Calvin when they comprehended that the domestication of animals and plants was first done symbolically. And Göbekli Tepe speaks to that truth. To domesticate the wild, they first captured the image of the wild. In addition to the symbolism and art that is found at Göbekli Tepe, the construction of the site must be addressed. It is important to reiterate the site lacks evidence for permanent settlement. Yet the amount of labor and level of organization required to build a single enclosure must have required immense resources, and it's a great feat of social engineering and planning. After cutting the limestone into enormously and heavy blocks, the stoneworkers would then be tasked with moving large pieces of stone to the site. It is not certain whether the actual carving on the rock occurred at the site or where the stone was originally cut. But even with our technological tasks to move something that weighs up to 10 tons, it can be assumed that the stones were carved with the reliefs on the ground, flipped over to carve the reverse side, and then moved into the upright position. Moving the large pillars from the quarried site to the designated position after carving might have created too big of a risk of damage, and thus it is probable that the carvings and polishing took place at the site. As stated by Schmidt, the work of pouring, transporting, and erecting tons of heavy, monolithic, and almost universally well-prepared limestone pillars was not within the capability of a few people. Pockmarks found on top of the pillars, as theorized by E.D. Van, denote a covering of destruction. However, if the enclosures were indeed intended to be uncovered, if the pockmarks were unintentionally left like that for a reason. First, the top of the pillars are high enough, they would not be seen by people on the ground. Second, they may have served some other function. For instance, they could have been used to collect water and to attract birds to roost, perhaps even intensifying the power of the pillar. Or totem. Another purpose for the cup marks on top of the pillar could have been to rest skulls of the dead, which may have served as a ritual where the dead would weaken their bodies through the body of the pillar. A final thought on the absence of a covering could indicate an astronomical function. An uncovered enclosure in a circular arrangement could have been symbolic of the heavens. The sun and the moon are both circular, and perhaps the enclosures were meant to be viewed from the heavens by some heavenly deity. In Neolithic times, the cosmos were significant, and from certain positions inside the enclosure, the sun or moon could have looked like it rested upon the tops of the pillars as it rose or sat in the horizon, essentially serving as a head and empowering the pillars even further. Although research has not been applied to determine that the enclosure's pillars held some sort of political function, it would not be a far stretch as sites like Stonehenge most certainly were constructed to observe the solstice. Each enclosure seems to be laid out in the same design, and the twin central pillars all lay on the same axis as the other enclosures. The abundance of light carved from the pillars indicates that springtime would have been very important to the shapers of Göbekli Tepe. In a sense, the builders surrounded themselves with images of nature that could not be controlled by any other means than setting their likeness in stone. In conclusion, the wealth of information about Göbekli Tepe, much of which is hypothetical as this excavation is still ongoing, and field notes and reports are either not published or not readily available. The evidence presented in the paper gives a brief overview of the site and to present my own findings and theories about the site. The world's understanding of our own past has been greatly reshaped as a result of Göbekli's discovery. Artistic ability in the Neolithic appears to be very advanced, and scholars are only beginning to analyze the images and data pouring out from the site. The preservation level certainly is implicit to an advanced and rigorous study in these fields. Throughout history, certain periods are marked by peace and artistic style and ability. Göbekli Tepe should be considered one of these peaks. As to date, there does not exist a level of natural or symbolic art of this style and antiquity in the PPNA. Göbekli's impact on the world is only being begun to be felt. There are many questions that need further discussion regarding the site. Most important are why and for what purpose Göbekli was constructed. There may lie beneath the rubble and backfill answers to the origin of some of our world myths or roots to some of the creation stories that serve as the basis of three major religions. For a group of hunter-gatherers that take so much of their time and dedicated to colossal construction is one of the most perplexing questions of all. Their world was harsh and dependent on sustenance to be provided from natural means. It may be this very intricate connection with nature that drove the construction of megalithic enclosures in the arid steppe environment of Anatolia. The Fertile Crescent region has always been thought of as the birthplace of civilization, and yet for 10,000 years, a major piece of this puzzle has rested undisturbed near the source of the rivers that brought civilization to Mesopotamia. The builders of Göbekli Tepe were advanced enough to build these impressive structures. However, they were living in a time when the domestication of plants and animals was only emerging or non-existent. These hunter-gatherers relied on nature to provide, and they were reciprocated through worship of the environment. Göbekli should be seen as a grandiose example of the reverence. The massive effort and labor force required to construct these enclosures is a testament to their piety. Those creatures that lived in the wild must have seemed like an enigma to the Neolithic mind. It is only natural that they would try to harness the power or ability of these mysteries. Naturally, by eating their meat, displaying the qualities of certain predator animals, wearing their skins, and dreaming of the ability to soar with the birds. At Göbekli Tepe, they attempted to control wilderness by first controlling its images. Once Neolithic man had symbolically captured their spirit through images, it was only a matter